And welcome to What America's Thinking, where we discuss key elections, demographic trends, and public opinion. I'm Julia Manchester.
And I'm Raphael Bernal. With the midterms behind us, both parties are now focused on the next big contest, already the 2024 presidential election. Let's get into today's top lines. So President Biden's approval continues to struggle. A November Emerson College polling survey shows Americans' approval of Biden is hovering at 39%. That's the same as last month, and it's pretty much stayed at around 40% since February.
And despite his unfavorability, the survey revealed in a hypothetical 2024 Democratic primary that Biden leads his own Vice President Kamala Harris and even Senator Bernie Sanders. If he were pitted against the only major Republican challenger thus far, Donald Trump, Biden holds a 4-point lead over Trump, 45% to 41%. You know, Raphael, coming out of the midterms, it's so interesting because Democrats obviously had a better than expected night. It gave them a boost, but I've heard a lot of back and forth as to whether this was a win or an endorsement or mandate for Democrats and Joe Biden, or if this was just Americans going against Trump and maybe choosing the lesser of two evils. So it seems like maybe that scenario could be playing out in this polling.
Yeah, I think you're right. Joe Biden is definitely the winner of this election, but he's kind of like the winner by default, right? Like he was, as a sitting president, you usually don't have anybody to like push off against, but he did because Donald Trump refused to get off the stage, essentially. And, you know, and Joe Biden, the one thing where he is really strong is in the Democratic Party, because I think his calling with Democrats has always been, I might be boring, I might be old, I might not be your favorite candidate, but I'm the guy who can definitely beat Donald Trump. And, you know, if he keeps proving that, like the Democratic Party is his to lose, right?
Yeah, and maybe Democratic primary voters are more savvy and maybe more strategic in thinking about that outcome, because on the Republican side, these midterm elections, we saw that in primary after primary, they chose the candidate that many of us, in the media or even, Democrats and moderate Republicans said, the candidate that wasn't necessarily electable, the candidate that was very partisan, very conservative, and not appealing to a broader range of voters. Some candidates that come to mind, Dan Cox in Maryland, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, Carrie Lake in Arizona, even though she's lost by a pretty narrow margin. So, it's interesting to see sort of the voter, decision and how that decision-making comes down to, how that decision-making really translates at the ballot box, whether it's, strategic in terms of politics, who they think will win, or if they're basing it sort of on their own, internal emotional feelings, if you will.
Right. And to that point, it looks like the very risky Democratic strategy of sometimes even supporting the far-right candidates in the Republican primaries, that actually paid off. That was, I think that might have been a bit too risky if it hadn't been I guess humility wins the day. If it hadn't been because the Republicans were basically declaring victory before even really competing in a general election, that strategy could have netted the Republicans, the far right Republicans, a lot more seats in the House. It was dangerous, but you think that had to do with that win, or was it just like Republicans shooting themselves in the foot?
I think that definitely played a role in it. And I've talked to some Republicans who have admitted that the candidates weren't the best, but they also point to committees like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee boosting these candidates in Republican primaries that were essentially election deniers. And we also saw that taking place to an extent in Arizona and Pennsylvania. And I can't tell you how many Republican strategists, but also Democratic strategists during the primaries earlier this year who said, this is Russian roulette. This is dangerous. If we actually want to push back on election denialism, we need to make sure that these candidates don't have any chance of advancing from a general election to Congress, to a state house, or a governorship. So, I think Democrats definitely took a risk. It paid off for them, but I think there's still some pushback within their own party and also among, more moderate Republicans who would argue that it was too much of a risk, especially after, what we've seen since the 2020 elections, January 6th, and those elections. So it's been interesting to really, I guess, watch that play out.
So you think the D-Trip will try that again? I'm betting no.
Yeah, I'm betting no at the moment. In fact, there was actually a recent memo that came out from the House Majority PAC. They're a Democratic super PAC dedicated to electing Democrats to Congress, specifically the House. And they essentially were talking about the issues they plan to message on going into 2024, such as abortion, such as the economy. And I find it fascinating that Democrats are continued to focus on the issue of abortion, because those of us in the media, and I said it on this show as well before the election, we were very skeptical as to how much abortion would be able to break through as an issue for voters, especially when we have a cost of living crisis really in this country. But it ended up coming in second in terms of issue priorities for voters, and it was a very close second. I think I've seen a number of exit polls from various outlets showing voters, 30% or so of voters ranking inflation as their top issue, followed by close behind, maybe in the 20% range, saying abortion was a big issue. So it's been fascinating to see that play out. And, I'm reporting on this as we speak. Democrats have shown no sign that they're going to hang up the towel on abortion messaging. We know that, in a number of state legislative sessions that are coming up this year, Democrats are going to be working to try to enshrine Roe v. Wade into law in a number of these state houses. And it's something that could very well happen because we saw Democrats perform very well in terms of state legislatures. That's a big shift because down ballot Democrats in these state races, for years now haven't been performing as well as Republicans, but they made some major gains this year.
Yeah, funny one with abortion. It's actually sort of the freedom issue. I covered that issue mostly among Hispanic Catholics, practicing Catholics who are against abortion. They do consider that life begins at conception. Like, that is their personal take on it, but they don't want the government involved in that decision. They feel that that's just not the government's role, and it's a freedom that they want to keep. Maybe not for themselves. They wouldn't want to exercise it for themselves, but they want others to be able to exercise that freedom. Moving on, what else have we got, right?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like sort of a libertarian take in terms of the government interfering. And, obviously you don't have a lot of Hispanic voters in this state, but New Hampshire in particular has sort of mirrored that as well. I mean, you may have, some voters that definitely lean towards the right, and you have a Republican governor who has walked a very fine line on abortion. But I think you see, the same sort of patterns lining up in those states where you don't want the government getting involved in such a personal decision. And, in New Hampshire in particular, we saw that, Maggie Hassan, the incumbent senator who won her reelection, was able to, message successfully on that and win. Now, there were a number of other factors, obviously, in that race, but it's just been interesting to see these various swing state senators, particularly in the Senate, because we know that the Senate obviously plays a role in terms of appointing and nominating Supreme Court justices, for example. Abortion seems to play a rather big role there.
All right, let's move on. What do we have on the Republican presidential primary side?
Yeah. So I think the bigger piece of news in the survey we were talking about before, Raphael, was that Trump leads the Republican pack in the primary. In that hypothetical matchup, he got 55% support, followed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis with 25% support, and others didn't really break double-digit support.
So education played a big role in that survey's findings. 71% of voters who said they would vote for Trump had a high school degree or less. Those with higher levels of education tended to side with DeSantis in greater numbers than they did Trump, but still Trump comes out on top no matter what. Is the DeSantis thing a flash in the pan, or is he for real challenger to Trump?
That's such a good question. And talking to Republicans this week, they acknowledge both sides of that question. They say, look, he is the most likely challenger to Trump. Remember, he is the Republican leader, and his state is the only state really on election night that saw a red wave. I mean, you know, this, Raphael, you've done reporting on this. Miami-Dade County, a traditionally Democratic stronghold, flipped for Republicans. And we saw that he handily defeated former Florida Governor Charlie Crist in his reelection bid. So obviously he's had a good night. He's certainly been telegraphing he is, preparing to launch some sort of presidential bid at some point, meeting with donors across the country, leaving Florida to campaign for Lee Zeldin, for example, who was running for governor here in New York, lost incumbent Governor Kathy Hochul. But, he's very much trying to build that national profile. That being said, though, there is such a thing as candidates peaking too early. Yeah. I'm old enough to remember in 2015 when Scott Walker was considered the Republican hopeful to watch in the 2016 Republican primary and presidential primary. He obviously lost. So there is a real danger of that. And it was interesting. I was speaking with one strategist who talked about the grind of a presidential campaign. How if you've never really been in the national spotlight before, meaning been in federal office, ran in a presidential primary before, you don't really understand the grind of it. It is an absolute grind. It's exhausting. And I would imagine that with a Donald Trump in the ring too, that would make it more exhausting for someone trying to primary him. So Ron DeSantis has to deal with that, but he also has to deal with the fact that he just won re-election in Florida, and he needs to be very careful about how he moves forward on this, whether that's immediately jumping into the race or waiting a little bit, until the state legislative session gets started. He doesn't want to be seen as cutting and running on Florida. So he has a very, very narrow line to walk.
I think you're right. He might peak too early. That is his biggest danger. I'm also a little bit suspicious of this idea of the thinking man's Trump. That difference in education that we saw. DeSantis' policies overall, his policy proposals are not any more elaborate or any less populist than former President Trump's. He might have a little bit of a more orthodox delivery from time to time, but he's still sort of got this idea of proposing simple solutions to complicated issues, which is how a former Mexican president recently defined populism. So, I don't think DeSantis has the policy legs to stand on yet. He can develop them, and he has a very good team in Florida, and the Florida Republican Party is a powerhouse, no doubt about that. But he doesn't have the policy legs to stand on to say, well, I can deliver where Trump failed in government. It's going to be, but he has 2 years to develop, right?
Yeah, he has 2 years. And my question is, how does he differentiate himself from Trump? You often see DeSantis, talking about and touting his work as governor during the COVID-19 pandemic. Speaking of taking risks and taking gambles, many would argue that he took a gamble with allowing Florida to have very, relaxed restrictions, or in some case, no restrictions during the height of the pandemic, very much leaving it up to localities. And we saw that, there were certain localities in Florida that very much did end up, imposing their own restrictions. We saw that the elderly population very much self-quarantined, and there was lots of self-quarantining in Florida. Obviously not a overall generalization, but we saw that happen. And, many would say that was a gamble on DeSantis's part, but DeSantis would argue, look, because of that, Florida's economy fared much better than states like New York or California. And you've seen a lot of people moving down to Florida since the pandemic. Very much talking about that, trying to brand it as the free state of Florida. But that pandemic approach sort of mirrored the approach taken by former President Trump, with also wanting it to leave it up to localities for the most part, and, wanting to lean into those more low restrictions, not, having a blanket shutdown for an extended period of time. So he has to differentiate himself there. And there's also the cultural issues that DeSantis has very much leaned into. And he leaned into a lot of that following the election of Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin last year. We've seen DeSantis with the Parental Rights and Education Act, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, as critics by critics in Florida, talking, in terms of there being some restrictions on talking about topics regarding sexuality and gender in the classroom. So he's leaned into that, but it seems like he's leaning into a lot of these issues that other Republicans like Glenn Youngkin are also leaning into. And Glenn Youngkin's also a potential 2024 contender. So he has to very much create his own lane. I think he is creating his own lane, and he's doing a pretty good job of it, but he has to continue doing that, because you're going to hear more Republicans pointing to their own records on that and pointing to, their own stances on those issues.
Yep, and you can never discount former President Trump. He always finds a way to come back. Speaking of which, we will be right back with more of What America's Thinking. And welcome back to What America's Thinking. The Georgia runoff is coming up, and we've got some new numbers to dive into. A new poll conducted by Fabrizio and Associates for AARP found that Democrat incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock holds a 4-point lead over Republican challenger Herschel Walker at 51% and 47% respectively. Julia, how do you think this is going to shake out?
It's so interesting comparing this to the last two Georgia runoffs in early 2021, because we saw the Democratic Party in Georgia very successfully galvanize a lot of young voters, in particular voters who had just turned 18 or even turned 18 between the general election in November and the runoff in early January of 2021. So, I remember a lot of chatter about the role young voters would play. And we saw that Gen Z voters this past election, meaning a few weeks ago in November of 2022, Gen Z voters overwhelmingly broke for Democrats, and I would say arguably, boosted the party. So I think if Democrats continue to very much target that voting bloc in Georgia, that they will have a much better chance, not only Gen Z, but also millennials as well. The only issue is this is obviously not an off-year election, but a runoff election. And we know that oftentimes in these runoffs, even if they get, overwhelming national attention, which in many cases Georgia is getting, they get lower turnout because it's not a national election day or an election day in the state. It's a runoff. So, that's a hurdle that Democrats are going to have to overcome. And I would say the good news for Herschel Walker is that older voters tend to lean more to the right. They're more likely to oftentimes vote Republican, and they're also more likely to come out and vote or vote in person on election days in runoff. So that's a definite plus side for him. But we know that this is a purple state. Things are going to be very, very close down to the line. So we'll have to see what happens.
What's your take on this whole second round voting? Georgia's one of the few states who does it. Is it working, or are voters getting tired of having to go to the polls and go back and go back?
Yeah, that's such a good question because we know that voter fatigue is real, especially not only in Georgia where they have to go back and, go back, but it's also just the political environment in this country is obviously so fatiguing for so many. So I think that definitely plays a role in it. I think we'll have more of an idea of how it's working after the runoff in terms of turnout and what that looks like. But, it seems to be certainly getting the attention of the national media and also, obviously, the media in Georgia. One thing I am curious about is, what turnout looks like after Democrats already secured the Senate, with Catherine Cortez Masto winning in Nevada. Obviously, there's still a sense of urgency because both parties want to win this seat, but we know that it ultimately won't really tip the scales in terms of who gets the majority. But I saw that Mitch McConnell, his aligned super PAC or a super PAC aligned with him, the Senate Leadership Fund, is dropping quite a bit of money in Georgia. We obviously know that the Democratic equivalent and the DSCC is very much down there. So the campaign apparatuses from both parties are really trying to work on galvanizing that vote in Georgia.
So we talked about, in this space before, we talked about that the Senator Warnock was either going to be running against Mitch McConnell, that didn't work out because of what you said happened in Nevada, or against Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Is that actually happening? Is the race against those two, or is it still against Herschel Walker?
It's hard to say. I mean, to an extent, I think it's absolutely against Mitch McConnell because of how much money Mitch McConnell is pouring into this race. I think Republicans feel that they need to win this seat just, even though it won't ultimately make a difference in the majority, they want to win the seat. In particular, Donald Trump wants to win this seat because they've put so many eggs in the Georgia basket. This used to be a somewhat reliably red state, and it's trended blue over the past 2 years. So I think this is something they definitely want to at least strongly attempt to achieve. And for Donald Trump, I would say that there's also a personal element in it as well because he endorsed Herschel Walker. And we've seen that so many of his endorsed candidates for Senate and in the governor's races haven't performed that well this year. So I think Donald Trump is another person who's watching this very closely. But Raphael, I guess I have a question for you. Do you think Donald Trump is going to be coming down to Georgia to campaign? Because the last time that happened in 2021 or early 2021, I should say, that didn't seem to work out so well for the two Republicans.
But the Donald came down to Georgia. I don't know. I don't know if it's in his interest. What we do know about Donald Trump is if he feels like it and if he thinks it's in his interest, he will be there. There's no doubt. But Herschel Walker has been getting a lot of support from his would-be colleagues in the Senate. We've seen Ted Cruz there. We've seen Lindsey Graham there. That Mitch McConnell money, I mean, despite the fact that Walker would probably be more of a Trumpist in the Senate, Mitch McConnell wants that seat because he wants a better window at recovering the majority. And he also, every time a Republican loses in the Senate, the number of Republicans that Democrats have to convince to get over the filibuster shrinks. And McConnell does not want to see that happen. McConnell doesn't want to lose people from his conference going over and voting with the Democrats. It's going to be a bit of a moot point because the House will be under Republican control. But, McConnell's always strategizing toward the future. And let's face it, in 24 and 26, Senate Republicans have very favorable election schedules. The people up for re-election are, sure, there are some Republicans up for re-election, but there are first of all more Democrats and Democrats in purple states. So you'll see, I think Mitch McConnell has a good case to be optimistic for the future and for maybe being the Republican leader again.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I thought it was fascinating last night to see the pictures and video coming off of Sean Hannity's show on Fox News. It was Herschel Walker in an interview, and he was quite literally flanked by Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham. So it shows sort of the sense of urgency they feel there in the Senate.
All right, and thank you all for watching. And that's another peek into what America's thinking. We'll see you next time.
And a happy Thanksgiving to all who celebrate.